Well, good afternoon and welcome everywhere. I'm Zlata, I'm graduate of the Gimon University. It's my honor to greet all of you in the Lomonosov of Moscow State University here. It's a huge pleasure for me to welcome to the 5th International Science Conference, Federalism in Contemporary Public Law. Fortunately, having sparked interest in most researchers, this conference has become a good tradition. What brings us all together 5th consecutive year with lifelong interest and today as well is contemporary federalism. Well, contemporary federalism is enormous scope for research, including retrospective analysis, prospective, studying common and distinguishes, comparison incomparable at first sight. Nevertheless, today we have a few reports to discuss because our goal is to shed light on the peculiarities of comparative federalism. Well, our agenda is firstly to dive into Africa's federalism, then to compare Nigeria and Pakistan experience, and to learn about what role does federalism in bioethics and fiscal issues play. Well, dear experts, many thanks for accepting the invitation to participate. I wish you good luck and a thrilling discussion. Please don't hesitate. Share your brilliant ideas with us.
Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's session on comparative federalism. This session is being held at our conference for the second year. Comparative federalism is the launch of federalist studies. It's a great honor for me to welcome here the distinguished Professor Jean Erck, who can be considered the ideal researcher of constitutional systems in Africa. Greetings to you, dear colleague. I hope you will enjoy today's event. It's an equal honor what a welcome here two of the founders of comparative constitutional law in Russia, Professor Alexey Avtonomov and Professor Alexander Troitsky. Professor Avtonomov has vast experience in applied comparative research, while Professor Troitsky is a major theorist of comparative method. So in many ways, I consider her my teacher. I'm very glad to see young scholars here as well. I hope this event will be very useful for them. And I'm glad to see my dear friend from Australia, dear Terefe. Hello. Would you speak first, or you here to listen?
I'm here to speak. Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. So can you see my slide?
Yeah, we can see.
Excellent.
So please take the floor.
Excellent. This is a work in progress, and I'm preparing this article for another conference. Because Vadim asked me to participate, and recently I became a dad. So I told him, if you hear a baby crying, please forgive me. So my talk today is about federalism, subsidiarity principle, and diversity management. So the issue is, do subsidiarity principle and diversity management, do they contradict or do they complement each other? That's the thing that I'm talking about. So as you know, in today's world, one of the main problems that we have, especially as I'm from Africa, I'm from Ethiopia, is diversity. That is ethnic, religious, and ethnic diversity. So constitutional design, political, like engineering, if you will, usually aim to manage diversity. That is usually done through federalism, and also as the principle of subsidiarity also talks about how we can design, not we can design, but we must design federalism as well. So do those principles or those justifications for ways of designing federalism or ways of allocating federal powers or powers in general, do they contradict or supplement each other? That's the main issue that I'm talking about and that my speech in this paper deals with. So there are like tons, as you know, there are tons and tons of definitions of federalism, and there's a conflict about those definitions and all that. But I don't want to bore you down with those definitions of federalism, but I just want to pick. I thought this would be like, even though it's a little bit broad, and this definition might include other federalism-like state formation. But this is a definition that is given quite a long time ago by one of the influential thinkers on this area. So, like this, basically, like federalism is that there are two levels of government. They rule the same land, and each government has its own sphere of area of autonomy or area of independent action, and also there is some guarantee that those powers will not be taken away from either the central government or from each level that the Constitution that the Constitution gave to those levels of government. So basically, there is in one territory, at least there are two levels of government. Those two levels of government have their own peculiar authority that the other cannot intervene, and this authority, this power, or these powers are guaranteed, which means they cannot be taken away easily. So these are the basic definitions of federalism. So having this definition in mind, let's go to our main issues. Okay. So when it comes to diversity and federalism, usually the nature of diversities are ethnic or religious or linguistic diversities. Okay, these diversities may be usually these diversities become a problem when they are politically salient, which means they are politically active. That is to say, political mobilization is done based on these identities. So when political action and the political demand mobilization is done based on identities, these diversities or identities are politically salient. When diversities or these identities are politically salient, they cause conflict. Okay, politically salient diversities tend to, or they may be reasons for conflict based on that diversity. And federalism become very relevant if identities are territorially defined. That is to say, if a single ethnic group occupies one territory, the other ethnic group, it has its own territory. When diversities are territorially defined, federalism now becomes very relevant in terms of managing those diversities. Why? Because federalism has territorial dimension in it. So if ethnic identity is to be managed through federal arrangements, ethnic groups or religious groups or those identities should be territorially defined. Okay, so when we say federalism is relevant if identities are territorially defined, we are saying the type of federalism that is going to be created is identity-based federalism. Some people call it multinational federalism. Some people call it multi-ethnic federalism or ethnic federalism for that matter. I tend to call it identity-based federalism because ethnic federalism kind of smashes the peculiar nature of religious and linguistic identity into ethnic identity. I personally prefer to call it identity-based federalism, and for one country it might be religious federalism. The other country may be ethnic federalism, or for instance, in India, it's become linguistic federalism. So that means each state, the boundaries of each state are created along ethnic groups. For instance, in Ethiopia, the Amhara ethnic group has its own state. It's one state. The Oromo ethnic group is one state. The Tigray. So those kind of state formation is identity-based federal arrangements or ethnic federalism or multinational federalism. So what kind of, now, if we say we have this kind of ethnic or identity-based federalism, what kind of identity-based federalism? There are multiple identity-based federalisms, okay? At least I can name 3 of them. There is Nigerian example. Nigerian example is ethnic-based or identity-based federalism. But what Nigerian way of doing ethnic-based federalism does is that it divides the biggest ethnic groups into many states, which means a single ethnic group, usually the biggest ethnic groups actually, do not have their own territory, their own home state, home subunit in the federal system. This is one way of doing ethnic-based or identity-based federalism. The other is Ethiopian way of doing it. Ethiopian way of doing it is like allocating one state for one ethnic group. One ethnic group has its own home territory and home ethnic group. We may add here, the Nigerian is, the federal government is really powerful, but the states are really weak. In Ethiopia, at least in terms of constitutional design, we may argue that the federal government is powerful. I mean, the states are powerful, and the federal government is weak, at least looking at the constitutional design itself, not the implementation of the constitution. When it comes to India, India is similar to Ethiopia in a way, but the federal government is highly powerful. So in terms of allocation of power, the federal government is really powerful, which is centralized federalism, but they have, in terms of creating boundaries for the states, each linguistic groups, except Hindi and the second biggest language, most of the languages or linguistic groups in India have their own territory. Okay, this is like three types of federal design in power allocation that is designed to manage diversity. Okay, now the question is, do this kind of federal design, do they contradict the principle of subsidiarity, or do they go along, do they agree with the principle of subsidiarity? In order to answer that question, first, I think we have to choose which federal system is good to manage diversity. I argue, actually, this is my PhD thesis. The main argument to my PhD thesis is I argue Nigeria and India. Why? Because the nature of ethnic and linguistic diversity is this. Okay, linguistic, ethnic, religious identities are, for me, constructed identities. Okay, political, social, and cultural factors determine their salience or their political activeness. So when ethnic and religious and linguistic identities are politically salient, when they are constructed, they cause conflict because ethnic groups compete with each other. They define what ethnic group is by looking at, by comparing at, by competing with their neighboring ethnic or religious or linguistic groups. So a federal system that dilutes, that downplays ethnic and religious identity is a federal system that discourages conflict. And therefore, Indian and Nigerian constitutional design, they downplay ethnic identity, and they uphold the national Nigerian and Indian identity. And those kind of constitutions are good or best to manage diversity when we compare that with Ethiopia. So basically, what I'm saying is a constitution that creates centralized federal government, or a constitution that divides ethnic groups into many states, those types of federal constitutions or federal systems are good to manage diversity. Now the question is, do those kind of designs conflict with subsidiarity, or do they complement the principle of subsidiarity? Now, let's talk about subsidiarity. What is subsidiarity really? What is it? The principle has many interpretations, and it's a lot of writers trace subsidiarity basically to Protestant and the Catholic religious theological philosophies, theological and theological political theological philosophies. So in a nutshell, at least I can provide two definitions. The first definition is that we have to, so the principle is that the lowest social organs or the lowest social body of a community should have the ultimate power to decide, on many political issues. Okay? The central government, or a government that's a little bit far from the people, should intervene only to help. So that's the first interpretation. So basically, family is natural, okay? Neighborhood is natural, church is natural. So family, church, and they say guild, those natural social organs, social bodies, social entities should have the power and the authority, like as much power and as much authority they can, okay? The central government or any central political authority should intervene in these organs or in these social bodies only to help. That's the first interpretation. And the second interpretation, usually supported by Catholic intellectuals, is that in terms of allocation of power among different levels of government, the main issue is the common good. That is, power should be divided to achieve the common good. Okay, whatever that common good is. So most of scholars take subsidiarity as a license or prescription for decentralization. They say subsidiarity demands decentralization. If we want to justify federalism based on subsidiarity, the power, okay, the power should be decentralized as much as possible. Okay, that's basically the arguments of many scholars who write on subsidiarity. So if we take the idea that subsidiarity principle is all about decentralization, we argue that India's, for instance, way of designing constitution to manage this diversity is contrary to the idea of subsidiarity, because Indian founding fathers thought the only way they can manage diversity, the only way they can control the construction of linguistic nationalism and linguistic identity is by creating centralized national government, by creating powerful national government, which means by going directly against the principle of subsidiarity. Okay. But when we take the Nigerian approach said we want the central government to be powerful. So in terms of mission, both the Nigerian government and the Indian government, the Nigerian constitution and the Indian constitution have the same mission. That is to create a strong central government. But the Nigerian way of creating strong national government is by disintegrating or by dividing the main ethnic groups. Here, what we have to understand is subsidiarity doesn't really focus on what are, or doesn't provide us enough guidance how to create the subunits. Okay, subsidiarity is all about allocating power, not about determining which organs should what kind of organ should we create in terms of creating multi-level government. Some scholars say that is left for natural law, even for positive law, or even for simple ontological, social ontological development. So specifically, subsidiarity principle doesn't talk about where should we create those those multi-level government. That is to say, for instance, should we divide the biggest ethnic groups into many states and then divide power to them? Or should we create one big state, like if we go to India, like one, even a single state is like really a country in terms of population, in terms of a lot of things. So should we do that? Subsidiarity doesn't answer that. Subsidiarity doesn't answer that. And finally, I would argue from those two interpretations of subsidiarity, we have to focus, like for me, B is more plausible, because at the end, why we need like different mechanisms or different justifications for allocation of power is to advance common good. Okay. In a divided country, it is almost impossible to think about common good in a society where people fight each other constantly along identity lines. So the idea of creating peace or reducing identity-based conflict would be common good. So I would argue that power divisions, whether it is for central government or whether it is like for state government, if it creates or if it produces that common good, which is peace, I argue that it goes supplementary with the principle of subsidiarity. But if we take, as many scholars take, the principle of subsidiarity to suggest simply decentralization, I would argue either we have to follow old Nigerian way of doing it, or we face the inevitable problem of living with identity-based conflicts. And I don't think the justifications behind subsidiarity cannot, in terms of value, cannot overrun the importance of peace in these divided countries. And thank you very much. If you have questions, much welcome to. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you a bunch for your report. Mostly, I'd like to thank you for your examples that you have nicely put here. Well, dear colleagues, let's discuss the topic. Who would like to answer any questions? Yeah, sure.
Alexey Avtonomov, thank you very much for your very vast and profound report. It's very interesting to listen to you. But I have some questions which might be useful as well for the further discussions in our section. I agree with you that subsidiarity principle is very important for each federation. But I'm not sure that it may guarantee stability of powers of each level of government. For the federal government, I mean, and just for the state or constituent unit government. I think that principle of subsidiarity might be also some kinds of source of flexibility of distribution and redistribution of powers, just taking into account your explanations. And I agree, it's just dated back to the 30s to the Pope Pius XII, and it is accepted by the most of scholars, this attitude to the subsidiarity as just natural distribution and acquisition of powers at each level. But you are completely right that a diversity in the federal states may also mean the diversity of possibilities, because subsidiarity means that each level of government has a possibility to realize these or that powers just provided by the Constitution and by the legislation. But in many cases, the possibilities of different constituent units of the federal states are different. And so from that point of view, it's a great problem of federal asymmetry. And we're also sometimes speaking about asymmetrical federations. And you know that India, which is one of the best examples, the states are not equal in their possibilities, in their real economic and political weight. I mean that some of them are equal in rights, but not all of them are equal in their real weight. And so, as you know, the Kashmir, one of the states for a long period of time had a constitution which was not common for the other states of India. And so the Nigerian example is also very interesting, because all the instability in the past, and I hope not in the future, also derives from the asymmetry of federation, asymmetry of different states, because there are some kind of oil states and others. So from that point of view, what do you think about the possibility of asymmetrical federation based on the principle of subsidiarity, and just as some kind of excuse for such asymmetry? Because you know that classic theory prescribes the equality in rights of all units of federation, but in reality, even in such federation, old federation as the United States, Alaska is a very peculiar example of a constituent unit, and it is not very similar to many other states. I don't mean just to go further, but some other states also different, and so there is certain asymmetry even in such old federations, and in new federations this asymmetry might be even greater. And from that point of view, diversity might be also explained by the principle of subsidiarity. I do not insist on it. It's a question. What do you think about all this? Thank you very much.
Should I respond on these questions? Okay. So yeah, I totally agree with you that subsidiarity. So, like when I read about the different sources about different writings of subsidiarity, people take subsidiarity what they want the principle to say about. That is, some people say the principle of subsidiarity is very, very like flexible, and we can use that principle to design or to allocate the powers between different levels of government the way we want to. Some people say no, that's not the case. That wasn't the original intention of, like, especially the Catholic Church. I agree with you. The Pope said so. The Pope's concern was like kind of absorption. That is, when the central government comes and absorbs the original community, for that matter, the original social bodies, So the Pope and the Catholic Church didn't like that. So for that reason, they came up with this theory of subsidiarity. No, the central government, you are even the word subsidiarity means help. Okay, like at least there are three types of epistemologies. Like the name derived from three. There are three theories about that, but the main one is the central government has to come to help whenever the local government failed. But others take this one. No, it's all about the common good. As you have mentioned, if asymmetry brings common good, we have to take that. We have to use asymmetry or even other means of power allocation to achieve common good, whatever that common good is. For the Catholic Church, common good is living according to the will of God. But so now the secular people, they can't accept this theological foundation of the subsidiarity principle. They took the main logic and took the main logic and kind of like expanded the theory a little bit. So what I agree with you, and what I'm going to argue is that we can also do that. Peace would be one of the common good that we can use subsidiarity by focusing on the achievement of common good, and then substantiate or even justify different forms of or different ways of allocating power among different levels of government.
Well, thank you very much. Dear colleagues, do you have any other questions? Well, dear Jean, please.
Thank you. Greetings to you all from Morocco, and Tarifa, thank you for this presentation. And I think we have to go a little further back for the origins of subsidiarity before the 1930s Catholic Church. It goes back to the 16th century, to Johannes Althusius and his ideas about resisting the powers of the Holy Roman Emperor, a Catholic state, and the protection of the Calvinist orders in the north of the country. So whatever was written by the Catholic Church in the 1930s is superimposing a modern view onto a more older form of autonomy for local levels of government. So I think in order to properly understand what subsidiarity is, one has to go to a period when the theory itself by Johannes Althusius was developed. So it doesn't mean help. It means the subsidiary level from above only should interfere when the local level of government fails to provide the expected sort of goals that are set. So it is an inherently multi-level understanding of political authority that is from a bottom-up understanding, as you presented in your talk, family, neighborhood, commune, village, town, province, state, and eventually empire. However, in the context of the African federal systems and subsidiarity you mentioned, I think there is one element that perhaps has to be added to the picture, and that is the infrastructural capacity of the lower levels of government to perform the duties that are expected. So in the countries that you presented on, particularly Nigeria and Ethiopia, but not only those, most African countries, the local level of government would lack the resources to fulfill the functions that subsidiarity itself was designed to provide. So anything from infrastructure to education to communication, most local levels of government not only lack the infrastructural capacity, lack the personnel, but would also lack the financial resources to set their own goals and fulfill their own policies. So almost everywhere on the continent, what we have is a dependence on the center to provide know-how, to provide taxation, to provide infrastructural capacity, and to appoint the personnel, the teachers, the doctors, the lawyers, and so on and so forth. So when we have certain levels of capacity problem at the local level, the very understanding of a bottom-up perspective becomes very difficult to put into reality. And add to this the fact that you mentioned in the Nigerian context that the system that was originally based on 3 forms of self-governing communities that corresponded not only to the ethnic groups, but to the preceding colonial infrastructure of Western, Northern, and Eastern Nigeria, corresponding to the Igbo, Yoruba, and Hausa Fulani, was not only an ethnic form of self-rule, but it also coincided with a couple of centuries of bureaucracy, of laws, of borders, of territory, of a functioning, no matter how perhaps pre-modern, but it's still a functioning level of government. So when you divide that up to lower levels of government that lack capacity, personnel, history, culture, so the very idea of subsidiarity, therefore, loses its original meaning and applicability to this context. So I think those 2 elements of bottom-up understanding of politics and infrastructural capacity perhaps has to be added to the picture when we discuss the applicability of subsidiarity in the African continent. But I also know that both Ethiopia and Nigeria are 2 countries that are in the process of trying to find homegrown answers to homegrown problems. So in that sense, I think it is very nice to hear that there is a lot of questioning, a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, assuming that things are not working as they intend to be, and new answers should be sought. So it was a pleasure to listen to your presentation, and thank you.
Professor Eric, thank you a lot for your comments. Dear colleagues, do anyone else have any comments who would like to proceed the discussion? Yeah, please.
Thank you for your message. Well, I have a question. Sorry for my English, which is not really professional, but there is an interesting approach to the concept of subsidiarity that is based on the idea that subsidiarity only needs to be to minimize the state violence, because some kinds of compulsion can be only provided by coordination of state and state members. So what do you think about this approach, which was provided also by Hayek, for example?
So subsidiarity, even Professor John Eric was also talking about. So basically, people who came up with the idea of subsidiarity kind of their fear was violence from the center, in a sense that taking as he said, violence of unjust government, and also that doesn't for them that doesn't go with the biblical understanding of what the good government is, and also taking or even totally abolishing the existence of the lower levels of society. They so that is basically what subsidiarity talks about in terms of combating violence. But I think we may also argue that in some sense, the mere fact that we allow the lower levels of government, we give the lower level of government, doesn't mean that we kind of avoid violence. So basically, for me, I would argue that even to some extent, empowering lower levels of government doesn't mean that we can definitely avoid violence in that sense. So avoiding violence, it has some other elements into it. It had like some other design has to incorporate with the idea of subsidiarity. But as most of people argue, and the main idea of subsidiarity was, in terms of violence, was fear of the central government coming and like unleashing some kind of violence on the lower levels of government in the community. That's my view. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, dear Terefe. You are the best.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say, John Eric, thank you for your comments. I totally agree with you. I saw the history behind, and I read an excellent book chapter and article from Andreas Forstel, that I think he's like a Norwegian guy who really addresses the history and also subsidiarity, the history with Nicholas Arony. Nicholas Arony is my supervisor. So I saw those arguments, but the majority of the literature on subsidiarity traces like the kind of the person that you cited, you mentioned, he was kind of considered to be the originator of federalism, because he talked about FEDAS, like some kind of argument, covenants between these communities, and Nick really believed that he's not only the founder of federalism, also the founder of subsidiarity. But in terms of infrastructure in Africa, I have kind of mixed feeling. One of the mixed feeling I have, also one of the arguments in Nigeria is that one of the reasons why like local governments depend on the central governments, because they haven't been given power. They haven't given resources. So it was intentionally, they were intentionally designed to be powerless. That's basically the arguments that's being forwarded. Some people with evidence, like with some kind of empirical evidence or not. But in terms of for you like about those three state federal systems of the 1960s. So my argument kind of with you, and maybe I have to think about it, is yes, that structure has the benefit that you have talked about, but also the detriment that is like the detriment of kind of that, even to the extent that Nigeria failed. Because of that structure, most of the people that wrote about why Nigeria failed contributed the failure of the 1960s government on the structure. So now, if we have to choose, how are we going to choose? That's the basic, even the main core of my article here is, we have like two values here that are coming to clash, That is the thing that I'm kind of talking. Yes, that is an excellent point. But what about peace? What about inter-ethnic conflict then? that's the dilemma that I'm kind of grappling with.
Thank you very much, dear Terefa. It's a very important report for us. It's first report. And please give my best regards to Professor Eroni and to Renato. And my congratulations to you on your fatherhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, really. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, perfect. Thank you a lot. May we go further? Well, dear Professor Eric, it's my honor to give you the floor. Well, dear John Eric has PhD in political science from McGill University, Canada, and LLD in public law from University of Pretoria, South Africa. He is professor in the Africa Institute for Research on Economics and Social Sciences of the Faculty of the Governance, Economics and Social Sciences of the Moroccan University of Mohammed VI. The title of the report is Making Comparative Federalism Truly Comparative, Lessons and Insights from the Law and Practice of Federalism in Africa. Professor Eric, please.
Thank you for that kind invitation, Zlata, and also thanks to Vadim for the invitation, and greetings to you all in Moscow and also across the world from Australia and beyond. I hope there will be an opportunity in the future to meet you all in person, but for today it has to be an online presentation, I'm afraid. Now, the university I am based at now in Morocco was built only very recently with a very explicit aim of combining scholarly and applied approaches to public policy reform in the African continent. Therefore, what we do here in Rabat is try to make sure that the theories don't remain only in the ivory tower, and their potential applicability to the developing world, particularly the African continent, is something that is foremost in our concerns in the way we do research. Now, in our earlier exchange with Vadim, he told me that perhaps federalism in the African continent is not that well known in Russia. So I will try to combine a little bit of analysis with a little bit of description in trying to deal with some of the issues that I think matter to us all, because we are now going through what probably historians in the future are going to call a turning point in world history. So everything, as we know, is changing. The power dynamics are changing, the alliances are changing, the overriding popularity of ideas concerning constitutional reform, democracy, political institutions are also changing. And when we look back at the last 25 to 30 years following the end of the Cold War, we also see that the Western liberal democratic capitalist model of constitutionalism as the only way forward has also failed to provide on its promises, failed to deliver on what it was designed to bring about: stability, security, progress, and prosperity. So in a way, what I want to do now is take a bird's eye view of the last couple of centuries, essentially, on the African continent, and how perhaps in the last 30 years, an over-reliance on Western understanding of federalism, of constitutional reform, of law and governance has led to a rather naive understanding of what works, and the disappointments that subsequently led to a general sense of discontent across the continent of Africa. Discontent in the sense that in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, in South Africa, three of the big federal systems in the country, there is an overall sense of unhappiness with federalism's ability to provide stability, prosperity, and security. And the consequence has been in Ethiopia, civil war, in Nigeria, overall discontent, particularly amongst the youth, increasing levels of disillusionment with established politics. In South Africa, also a disappointment with how the end of the apartheid regime and the promises that followed the new democratic system have failed to materialize. What I'm going to argue in this paper is one of the main reasons here is that in scholarly terms, our overemphasis on a few Western models of federalism as not only the analytical way forward, but also as the prescriptive way forward, and how the short time span of imposing constitutions from above have led them to establish deep roots in the society. I've been involved in 2 federal reform projects on the continent, in South Sudan and Somalia. So for our Russian colleagues who might not be familiar with the details, these are 2 countries that have had in the last 25 years, one after another, federal reform project imposed upon them. And yet the federal government has barely established its authority into the outer neighborhoods of their capital cities, respectively of Mogadishu and Juba. Unfortunately, because of layers and layers of foreign-inspired federal constitutional projects that have failed, in overall terms, federalism has also acquired a bad name in these countries. Because mostly, federalism has been based on the experiences of federal Germany, of Switzerland, of Canada, of Australia, of the United States, and very little interest has been devoted to homegrown versions of federalism, even when they are not formally federal in perhaps the Western literature. So therefore, there are a couple of things that the paper tries to highlight. One is the need to emphasize function over form when we study federalism. That is to say, the form of federalism, strictly according to the Western understanding of strict distribution between levels of government, constitutional division of competences, a high Supreme Court, a constitutional court that is the arbitrary when it comes to the division of responsibilities, a checklist of competences that divide the provinces, the cantons, the state level from the central government, seems to have created a scenario where some of the older forms of autonomy and union, which I believe is perhaps a more appropriate way of studying federalism, has led to a situation where already existing forms of dividing power between regions, between communities, between tribes, between principalities, between kingdoms at the local level and a central authority has gone understudied. And because it has gone understudied, there has been a consequence that federal formal reforms, often carried out by international organizations and funded by various international agencies, has first, because of a failure of knowledge, and secondly, because of the assumption that best practices can travel at ease and can be copy and pasted and expected to deliver the same results, have led to this sort of shortcomings of the ideals of federalism. So therefore, one of the main issues here that I want to highlight is the need to study indigenous forms of power and autonomy, and going back to both pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial eras in trying to understand what works. And secondly, at a more methodological level, the importance of studying not only successful examples of federalism, but also failures of federalism. That is to say, when we take a longer historical view and look at when federalism has failed, we might be able to highlight, to identify, and perhaps get a sense of when federalism does not work, so that the next time around, when we are sitting around and discussing federal formulas, we at least have learned from the past lessons of when certain failures have happened. So I see that in the audience, there are those who study more comparative forms of federal law and governance, as well as those with a more international perspective. So in that sense, there are two communities of scholarly perspectives I think are very important. One is at a comparative level, studying not only the successful examples of where federalism works, Germany and Switzerland and elsewhere, but also when federalism has failed. The African continent is a graveyard of failed federalism. There are so many examples of federal projects that have not survived. So I think at a scholarly level, there is a need to study when and how the past examples of federalism can teach us the reasons for failure. So I'll briefly go over these, but later on, I'll be more than happy to go into detail if there are further questions. The second one is, as those of us who constantly look at the comparative level of constitutional design, institutional design, constitutional ideas, federal reform projects, there is perhaps also a need to move beyond at a higher level of analysis and look at a very, very critical factor that tends to be underexplored in the study of federalism, and that is the importance of international factors, the importance of the international level of the importance of power dynamics that emanate from factors above the state that is often the unit of analysis in our study. So to give you a very quick overview of the history of federalism in the African continent, highlight two of the main colonial powers and their different forms of colonialism on the continent. Now, the French and the British abroad did exactly the way they saw their own country. So France, first the Second Empire and afterwards the Third Republic, as it was centralizing itself, and especially during the Third Republic, as it saw any form of regional autonomy, any form of diversity, any form of linguistic, ethnic, religious heterogeneity as a barrier to its desire for progress and for modernization. Abroad, it did the same thing. And similarly, as Britain itself had an inherent fear of standardization, of centralization, almost as the mirror image of what was happening in France, Britain similarly, in a more pragmatic way, approached its colonial experience in a way that highlighted more pragmatic concerns over the more idealist concerns. So everywhere on the continent where the French ruled, they dismantled the existing traditional kingdoms, various forms of state structure that existed throughout the continent. In France, they managed to rebuild something else, but on the African continent, they were only successful in the first phase of this experiment, and that was the dismantling. In the recreation phase, they often fell short at the level of infrastructure, at the level of education, at the level of training, of bureaucracy. What they did was a successful dismantling of traditional institutions in Africa, but an unsuccessful construction of new ones. The British, on the other hand, had a more pragmatic understanding of colonialism. So they often found whatever was functioning at the local level and entrusted this local level of government with self-government powers, with an overall constitutional architecture that brought in the colonial rule. So what was known as indirect rule was not because the British had an inherent respect towards indigenous forms of rule, but because they wanted to govern on a small budget, large parts of the colonial empire without having to commit soldiers and bureaucrats and funding. So everywhere they went, they found a local king, a paramount prince, an emir, a sultan, and recognized the existing form of law and governance and essentially outsourced the colonial governance to these already existing forms of political authority. So this was pragmatically the way to govern a large empire without having to commit the soldiers, the money, the bureaucracy. Of course, there were parts of the continent where there were settler colonies. So Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia more precisely, present-day Zimbabwe, South Africa and Kenya received European settlers. And here we have not indirect rule, but the appearance of self-government was limited to only those who had the property and the education to vote, the whites. So, so in these places, the appearance of self-government in the form of a dominion was a way to disenfranchise local. So when we fast forward to the post-Second World War era, when the United States and Soviet Union replaced France and Britain as global powers, there was an initial period of constitutional reform in former French and former British colonies, with the expectation that this would be a gradual process. But with the end of the Suez Canal debacle, and with the appearance of the quick retreat of Britain and France from global sphere, and the reappearance on the continent, or the appearance more precisely of Soviet Union and the United States as two global powers, the slow process of providing self-government to former African colonies suddenly, quickly, and without much preparation, led to the new independent constitution. From Nigeria to Kenya to Uganda to Zambia, there was a period of initial euphoria about self-government. Almost everywhere, self-government started off with a continuation of the existing forms of protectorates that the British colonial system had recognized. So this was either federalism explicitly, as it was in Nigeria, as it was in Tanzania, between Tanzania being half Tanganyika, the other half Zanzibar, the Tanzan, the early Ugandan constitution that recognized the traditional kingdoms in a federal way, the early Kenyan federal constitution that recognized the traditional kingdoms, the earlier Zambian, the former Northern Rhodesian constitution that recognized the traditional kingdoms. So we have this first phase of federalism in Africa that last same time period, the Mali Federation from the French Sudan also dismantled itself. The Senegambian Federation dismantled itself. Federal Cameroon voted itself into a unitary state. So this time period includes almost everywhere on the continent, the federal systems falling prey to the new pressures of international politics. And that is, either they went to be on the side of the socialist revolutionary principles and thereby the Eastern Bloc, or the more liberal capitalist reforms, and this time under the Western influence. So both the West and the East, in terms of the Cold War dynamics, did not want federalism because they wanted to make sure that the government in power was on their side. So therefore, the big lesson here from this first period of federal failures in Africa is that you could design federal constitutions as much as you want. You could think about the division of responsibilities as much as you want. But if you don't take into account the international factors, then all of these constitutional reform processes will end up being judged as rather naive by constitutional historians and political historians. So therefore, anything that works has to take into account the international dynamics that matter. The big lesson from looking at the long history of Africa is this. In most of my research, I've recently started looking at some of the older traditional forms of self-government in various parts of Africa, particularly in Ghana, in Uganda, and Zambia. And although they have been voted out or eliminated from formal political structures, They continue to have relevance to the day-to-day workings of people's sense of loyalty, of their sense of legitimacy, even on minor issues that have to do with day-to-day public policies. I was a visiting professor in Ghana at the height of the COVID crisis. I was in the northern city of Kumasi, which is the house of the Ashanti Kingdom. And every day there would be posters around on bus stops, on lampposts, little booklets being distributed about wear a mask, keep a social distance, and nobody paid any attention to what the official bureaucrats from the Ministry of Health were saying. Until the Ashanti, that is the Asante king, actually told his people, he said, look, these health officials are doing this for your own good. Please respect their advice on wearing masks and keeping a social distance. One day, the entire city changed. So therefore, the big lesson here, I think, is whatever has deep roots in a country's particular history, society, whatever is considered legitimate in the eyes of the people, not foreign imposed, not alien concept, not different constitutional labels, public policy reforms, or institutional design best practices that fail to resonate at the local level. Something that appeals to people's sense of homegrown legitimacy, I think, has the longer term of success, the promise of success. So when we look at both analytically the past of the African continent, but also as we reflect on workable federal solutions for the future, in a future world where we don't know where things are going to go, but one thing that we can know for sure is that there is no longer going to be the consensus that defined the 1990s and the early 2000s about the international community, international funding, and international. Whatever work will have to be homegrown. So therefore, I think we have to be at peace with something that is more heterogeneous, something that is more uneven, something that is perhaps less clear in its formal design, but more important in its function to provide a balance between the local and the national. Something that seems to reconcile autonomy and union, I think, will have longer term of success. So therefore, in this quest, we need constitutional lawyers, political scientists, but increasingly political anthropologists. So I'll leave it at there, and based on questions, I could open up the cases a little more and answer your questions. But thank you once again for listening, and bye-bye.
Well, Professor Eric, thank you a bunch for your informative report. And to be candid with you, I highly appreciate that you provide us with historical overview of the fundamental topics that African nation deal with nowadays. So let's launch the discussion, dear colleagues. Yeah, please.
Well, thank you very much for your report. And my question, which I'm quite interested in, will sound like, well, actually, does a difference between different models of colonization influence, for instance, French model or British model, influence a model of federal transit, or this influence isn't very big? Thank you very much.
Zlata, should I answer now or should I wait for other questions?
Yep, I suppose that it's high time we had a discussion at the current moment.
Okay, so this is a very important question, and I think I mentioned towards the end of my talk, we need constitutional lawyers, we need political scientists, we need anthropologists, but I think we definitely need historians for anything to be in part of it. So we are now going through a time period, and the long-term consequences of past decisions, the influence of history on contemporary politics becomes a topic that is not only an academic exercise, but has real relevance. So this question, I think, is very important. And I think we could say that the British and the French were almost mirror images of each other when it came to both how they organized their own countries, as well as how they carried out colonialism in the African continent and elsewhere. So the French, as I mentioned in the talk, did things abroad the way they saw things at home. And that was a state that is an activist state, a state's job that is to change society, to bring about progress by creating free citizens, by dismantling existing barriers to national unification and civilization, and bringing progress, prosperity, and development through change. So when the French wrote about fraternité, égalité, liberté, the French were neither free, nor they were in fraternity, nor they were equal, but they wanted to reach those aspirational goals. The British, on the other hand, had a more pragmatic, step-by-step understanding of their political system, which gradually, starting with Magna Carta onwards, brought in any challenger into the system slowly and without an overarching form of idealism, did things through pragmatic steps. And both countries in Africa followed colonialism according to the same principle. So the French believed that they had a civilizational mission, that their job was to change. So they wanted to, of course, now with the benefit of history, we know that both colonial experiments were exploitative in nature, but at least the justification, the purported sense of legitimacy that they projected onwards was different. So the French believed in the self-styled civilizational mission, which led to the dismantling of traditional authorities everywhere they went. And they tried to rebuild the societies in the view they had of themselves, and it often failed. So when you think about the former French colonies, most of them have failed to reach a level of political stability, and they are still fighting many of the political issues that divided them 50 years ago. The French colonial experience, that is the outcome. And the British one, there seems to be two different outcomes. Wherever there were dominions, that is to say, settler colonies, instability remains, because the earlier period of disenfranchisement of the locals has created long-term problems that have been impossible to resolve in the short run. But elsewhere, where there have been strong protectorates, we see more of political stability. Now, more often outside the African continent, people are familiar with the problems of the African continent, but there are also elements of Africa where things work. And one case that goes unnoticed is Botswana. Botswana is a country that has regular elections, that has a system of competing political parties, no political violence. Of course, people disagree with each other, sometimes very passionately. But one of the reasons for this was there is an element of continuity between the colonial, or more precisely, between the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial era, because it was a relatively unimportant element of the British Empire that was within the desert of the Kalahari Desert and essentially a non-strategic area. So the British recognized the existing chieftains under the system of indirect rule and allowed them self-government and a form of an overarching sort of belonging to the British colonial state, but without too much day-to-day presence on the ground. Post-colonial politics has created a scenario where the Botswana state is seen as legitimate in the eyes of the locals. The upper house of parliament, the Senate in Botswana, is called Ntloya Dikgosi, which is the house of chiefs. So some of them are hereditary chiefs, The others are elected. So even the most illiterate villager in the most remote village of Botswana sees the political system as his or her own political system, and not as a colonial imposition over which one has to commit. Similarly, Ghana, despite its political upheavals, has a functioning political system, again, because the people see the local kingdoms, principalities, traditional forms of authority and law, something that belongs to them and that function. So there's a very long answer to your question, but it is a very important question. And I think everywhere in the world, human beings want a sense of dignity of having their own institutions and power. At the same time, they want progress, they want modernity, they want things that also answer their contemporary concerns. That balance between a sense of ownership, a sense of a homegrown sense of legitimacy, together with a more aspirational modern desires and goals, is a fine balance that could only be achieved by the inhabitants of the country. So yes, I believe our job is to provide many, many options of what could be done, but at the end of the day, it is the locals who have to decide which part they want for their own country. So it's a fine balance between something that has deep roots, but also the potential to take that plant with deep roots in a direction by pruning, by providing good fertilizer, by watering it precisely, by keeping it in the shade. So without roots, the plants would wither, but without care, it would also. So sorry for the metaphor, but I'm trying to highlight the point of how the British colonial system seems to have provided maybe perhaps more hope to homegrown constitutional reform projects succeeding, notwithstanding the exploitative nature of colonialism in any form.
Thank you very much for a very informative answer.
Well, perfect. Any other comments? Any other questions? Please.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Eric, for your both report and comments. I mean, just the comment to the previous report and the comment to the question, which is also very important. So we can say that there are some other models as well of colonization, as Spanish, Portuguese, and so on. Portuguese is quite important for Africa as well, for as quite big countries are still considered to be speaking Portuguese. But I would like just to return back to one of your theses within your report, which is also very interesting, the functional form of federalism. And so there's some kind of, I agree with you, we're looking at federalism, first of all, from the Eurocentrical position. I mean, just as the history of federalism in Europe and as well in in the United States and Canada, but they also borrowed Europe experience and developed at their own soil. But what I think that, and I agree that in many cases, federations failed, not only in Africa, but in Asia. Everybody remembers the experience of Myanmar when it was Burmanian Union, but it also failed, and it was proclaimed as a union state or federal state, but it never converted into a real federation. But there are also maybe not bad examples, maybe not in Africa, but not far from Africa. For example, the United Arab Emirates, which has a completely different experience, and their federation is maybe contrasting or maybe opposing the European experience. There is no parliamentarism there. There are quite a lot of other peculiarities of authority actions, but it is a real federation. And so from that point of view, what do you think? Probably we need just to look at it from the dialectical point of view and some kind of a dialectics of form and of the form and the content, because the form might be very similar to what we know from the European and North American experience, but the content might be different, and the content may bear in mind the economic, social, mental, ideological, and other aspects of the state of the society itself, because it's impossible to reproduce the experience, European experience on other continents. And so from that point of view, probably it's possible just to take the experience of federalism, but reproduce it on its own soil. You also mentioned, and you reminded us of Altuthius and his theory. And at his times, he was not he was not understood very well. He was considered as some kind of a supporter of feudal dispersity of the state. So that's why. But actually, we understand that his thought was much more profound, that he thought about the principles of subsidiarity and in the modern understanding how to organize the different levels of the government, having federal states. He didn't call them federal. He even didn't mention, it might be better than me, that he called them consociations, maybe not association, but consociations of people. And so from that point of view, probably we need just to rethink the experience of Europe and just to use the form, filling it with a little bit different content, taking into account the experience of African peoples in Africa, for example, but not only in Africa, in some other parts of the world as well. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful just to be in this discussion with you, Professor. Thank you very much.
I think these are very important comments and very important, not only in scholarly terms, but also as we reflect on a future that is very uncertain for the entire world. So I think almost everywhere in the world, human beings want stability, they want security, they want prosperity, they want their relatives, their children, their friends to be able to live without the fear in a stable society and plan according to the future without worry. So I think, therefore, the key is not perfectionism on paper, but it is about things that work, things that keep stability, things that prevent war. So when we talk about the success of federalism, it is often projected in positive terms, meaning higher levels of growth, better economic policies, and so on and so forth. But I think it is important to think about negative success in the sense of preventing civil war, preventing the breakdown of law and order, preventing crime, preventing governments usurping the powers. And all this means that perhaps the emphasis on the ballot box, where 50% plus one become the legitimating force for governments everywhere, we have to highlight, which you correctly pointed out, in non-Western experiments of holding the center to account and preventing absolutism in any form. be it ideological, be it religious, or be it electoral. So in that sense, I think almost everywhere in the world, political systems were designed in a way to make sure that the center is accountable, either to regional feudal lords, religious authorities, social classes, and increasingly, I think as we reach a modern era, these collective checks and balances, these corporate forms of division of responsibilities that prevent centralization and 50% plus one are essentially the function of federalism that we have to study and examine more carefully. Almost everywhere, this fetishization with the ballot box has created disappointment for the inhabitants of the countries that they live. I think Afghanistan is a sad, sad example of how 25, 30 years of constant foreign intervention has ended up creating a result that is perhaps worse than what it used to be 25 years ago. So therefore, my overall belief is that one has to first look at what works, what functions, what is considered as legitimate in forms of checks and balances, division of powers, a sense of legitimacy in the eyes of the locals. And once we acknowledge the functioning form of barriers to centralization, barriers to uniformity, barriers to 50% pluses domination, then try to turn that into something that is more modern, that could bring into the picture individual rights. So my starting point is a collectivist one. So in many ways, I want tradition to serve modernity. So it might sound a little schizophrenic, but I believe that what already works has more chance of succeeding in the long run when the taps of international aid are turned off, when international experts stop coming, and when international news media starts losing interest and stops listening. So whatever works has to be organically a part of a particular country's society, history, and I think that always has more chance of longevity than perfectionism on paper.
Sure. Thank you very much, dear Professor Erk, for your presentation. And I completely agree with the idea that we have to study not only the stories of, let us say, successful success, but also the stories of a failure. And as for me, the story of failures is even more interesting because success, well, it's just boring, and the failure is quite inspiring. But obviously, the most interesting thing is to understand the reasons, the causes for failure. So if it's convenient, I would go beyond your topic on Africa to the more methodological point. What do you think when we are looking for reasons for special regulations, successful or not? Can we be scientifically neutral? I mean, objective, impersonal? Or we always try to find out some favorite facts, economic, political, or religious, and we have only the illusion of objectivity in the end, or more optimistically, as I could see, you yourself took very broad historical context. Indeed, it was absolutely impressive. So do you think that to be truly comparative means to take as broad context as we can? Thank you.
I believe the methodology question is very important here, and and I hope I don't offend anyone when I say this, but sometimes the problem with federalism studies is it is written by people who like federalism a little too much. And so there is a belief that federalism is good, so let's try to prescribe, advise, tell people how much it works. But I think the study of when federalism fails is also important. Federalism fails, I think, for two main reasons. One is sometimes in the eyes of the majority population, or in the eyes of those who are close to the state, federalism is sometimes seen as a slippery slope towards secessionism. Or towards a country's particular region, minority region, splitting to join their brothers and sisters across the border and ethnically in a region of another state. So this perception might be wrong, perception might be right, but once it's there, the reaction leads to an outcome that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is the idea that federalism is always the beginning of the end of a country, leads to a sense of outcome. So when you think about Europe's successful federal system, Belgium and Spain, only became successful as federal systems after they became part of the broader European Union. A Belgian state, which puts Dutch speakers in the north and French speakers in the south, would have considered federalism as a threat to its physical survival if the Dutch in the north and the French in the south were physical potential enemies of the Belgians. So I think one can, in fact, have an objective analysis of this, and that is to say, the state authorities, those who are in power, or the majority in a country, first has to be convinced that there is an overarching sense of peace and stability that will prevent the dissolution. If, say, Turks knew and had established treaties with Syria, Iraq, and Iran, that Kurdish autonomy does not lead to separatism, that there is a possibility of regional autonomy without state breakup, I think federalism would have had a chance of success. So therefore, I think a big lesson from looking back at the failures of federalism is the reaction of central state authorities to any demand for autonomy, and the perception that this is a slippery slope towards dissolution. The second one is the influence of international factors, international allies, international friends, and various alliances on domestic politics. So that is also an important one. And the other lesson, I think, is whatever works has to be embraced and owned by the locals and not seen as a foreign imposed system. More importantly, I think your question at a methodological level was highlighting something that is a key, and that is, can we be objective in our study of the reasons of failure, or are we either consciously or unconsciously projecting our own personal experiences, our own national backgrounds, our own ethnic loyalties or partisan preferences? Of course, I don't think we can ever be completely devoid of our personal leanings, but the effort or the desire to try to do so in itself would be a big step forward. And for this reason, I think comparative analysis, even when our research is not formally comparative, could bring a degree of counterfactual thought exercises that force us to bring clarity and reflection on what happened else. Did the same policy lead to something else? Does autonomy always bring stability? Why have the Belgians, the Swiss managed to retain federal peace? Would Belgium be able to reach the same degree of stability if it was not in the heart of Europe, but somewhere between Iraq and Turkey, for example? These are all questions we have to ask ourselves, which probably slowly, gradually bring us to a closer approximation of what the reality is. But I always tell my students one thing. I say, there are two types of theses, I say, perfect ones and finished ones. So we also have to accept that perfectionism is beyond reach, but we can only try slowly and gradually trying to reach a closer, a sharper step towards perhaps what future generations will be able to reach. So, but very important question. The methodology is very important here. So federalism has to be studied by those who also don't like federalism, not only those who like federalism.
Thank you very much indeed.
Well, perfect. So, dear Professor Eric, thank you a lot for the participation in our discussion. We may go on, right? Or we may go on. Am I right? Well, let's dive into a comparison Nigeria and Pakistan experience, and I'd like to give the floor to our next speakers. They are Anna Zelter and Ilya Kilbakov. So please take the floor. Well, Ilya and Anna are undergraduate students of Faculty of Law of Lomonosov Moscow State University. And the topic to be discussed is the following. Nigeria and Pakistan on the path to federalism, comparative and historical analysis. Please, welcome.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much for invitation. We shall introduce you our research, which is aimed at the comparison and the presentation. Please. Yeah, thank you very much. Which is aimed at the comparison of different models of federalization. And we actually focused on the topic of federalism in post-colonial states in Africa and Asia, and particularly Nigeria and Pakistan. We focused on it for several reasons. First of all, as it was stated before, even though the historical and institutional phenomenon of post-colonial states is a popular and significant object in political science, such spheres of knowledge as constitutional theory and particularly comparative constitutional studies are just starting to master this topic. So this topic hasn't been mastered yet. Another point to consider is that both Nigeria and Pakistan are highly heterogeneous states, and as a consequence, their cases can allow a researcher to analyze federalism as a mechanism of social consensus.
So we have formulated several questions on problematic issues, and the solution will be developed during our project. The first question is which factors influence the formation of federalism in Nigeria and Pakistan? Another one is what are the features of heterogeneity in Nigerian and Pakistani societies? The third one is which role colonialism and its institutions played in the formation of federalism in Nigeria and Pakistan. Do the effects of colonial past affect the character of modern federalism in these two states? And the last one is the aim of our research. What are the key similarities and differences in the models of Nigeria's and Pakistan's transition to federalism, as well as the factors of these transitions?
So we shall start with the first object of our research, which is Nigeria. And by the time of its independence from Britain in 1960, Nigeria was already a political entity with a federal structure. The principles of federation in Nigeria were established in 1954, and these principles included, for instance, the division of competence between the federation and the subjects, and the determination of areas of exclusive, joint, and residual competence. Actually, this didn't happen overnight. And for a deeper study of the nature, essence, and the main features of federalism in Nigeria, it is necessary to consider the factors that have influenced the development of federalism in Nigeria. So these factors can be generally divided into two big groups. The first group can be called a group of primordial factors. So these are the features of historical and ethnic heterogeneity in Nigeria. So let's start from them. The territory of Nigeria is multi-component. It consists of 3 macro regions, which are actually not administrative, but rather geographical and historical. These regions are the Nigerian North, the Nigerian Center or the Middle Belt, and the Nigerian South. They are very different in terms of population. The Nigerian North, which is also called the Nigerian Sudan, is a region which occupies most of the country. Being involved into trans-Saharan trade in the ancient and medieval times, it was generally affected by the Arabian culture and Arabian language. So Arabic language is dominating here. This area is predominantly inhabited by 2 big groups of tribes, ethnic groups. They are Hausa and Fulani, who are actually predominantly Muslims. The center of Nigeria, or a middle belt, can be treated as a transitional point between Nigerian North and Nigerian South. So it's a mix of culture. And Nigerian South, which is the most immense economic driver of Nigeria and the most hugely populated region of this country, is predominantly populated by the tribes, the ethnic groups of Igbo and Yoruba, and it is predominantly Christian, however, with a large influence of local beliefs, local pagan beliefs. So these division into regions, this division into ethnic groups also form the heterogeneous character of Nigeria as a political entity. And actually, let's turn to another factor which can be connected with colonial past, colonial background in Nigeria. Nigeria as a political entity had been a part of the British Empire for about 100 years, since 1860s, when Lagos, a port in the south of Nigeria, became a part of the empire, to the 1960, a year of Africa, when Nigeria gained independence. So it was a part of a British Empire, and we're going to examine the influence of British colonial rule on the federalism in this country. The first feature of colonial rule that we can actually state is the policy of indirect government. The policy of indirect government was a British colonial policy which was initiated by colonial administration for pragmatic reasons. First of all, for economic reasons, to reach an economy of the budget, but still to rule effectively. And this policy was aimed not at the long-term, not at the long-term aims, long-term goals, but it was aimed at short-term goals connected with governmental practices of British colonial administration. The main consequence of this rule, of this governmental practice, was the increase in interregional disparities between different regions, between different states, and actually it also was very important. Another point, and as a consequence of a British colonial rule, it was a growth of nationalism, both in the north and in the south, which constituted the background of federalism in the post-colonial period, for instance. The third peculiarity which we outlined was that the British policy was not really brisk. It was gradual, and it was also dictated by pragmatic reasons. So the gradual transition from a unitary form to a regionalist country also led to federalization. One of the measures of this gradual transformation was the constitutionally mandated general elections of 1951, which accelerated the process of regionalization and finally led to the federal structure of the state according to the Littleton Constitution of 1954. Well, analyzing aforesaid, it's important to say that colonization was peculiar for its preparation, gradual preparation of federalism in Nigeria, but it cannot be considered in isolation from the primordial features of Nigeria. For instance, its ethnic and historical heterogeneity, which also influenced federalism.
Nigeria's colonial past has also left its mark on its economic status. So there was a refocusing from the supplying of goods to the key to the provision of access to national resources. Gradually, the development of corporations in developed countries became a key factor in the search of profits in the developing world. Britain, in order to promote its interests in Nigeria, had to integrate its economy into the global one. So that became a new phase of Nigerian economy. The economy had become monetizing. One of the characteristics of the rentier state in this situation is that the wealth of natural resources tends to be concentrated in the hands of a few, who then constitute the rentier class. The distribution of rentier class wealth depends in turn on the concentration of oil resources in a certain area, in a certain territory. Hence, there is a greater or lesser degree of political power held by the subjects of the federation who measure their functional power in the volume of the energy complex they control. Lacking scientific knowledge and the capacity to create wealth through a developing approach, the state has become technologically dependent on oil corporations to manage development at home, unintentionally bringing upon itself the paradox of affluence. Another factor that influenced the development of Nigeria as a federal state was the development of its economy. The Federal Republic of Nigeria is an oil-centered state. It means that its economy is built on energy resources, oil in particular. Nigeria's enormous energy potential has become its own bane. As mentioned earlier, the inability to move to a long-run savings rule due to the need to get money in the shortest possible time and in the fullest possible quantity to address more pressing issues prevents any balanced policy in the oil sector of the economy in particular. So price policy is in the hands of the rentier class, which also has its ethnicity. And the clash of the rentier class with the rest of the population leads to misinformation and more problems in all public spheres because of the lack of compromise. So one of the problems of Nigerian economy is also the Dutch disease, is a story of resource reallocation between sectors. This imbalance is equilibrated by an increase in the relative prices of non-tradables, thereby attracting resources away from the non-oil sectors of economy. And the increase in consumer income has caused inflation in the country at the same time as the influx of the imported goods has increased, leading to the popularity needs to buy products from different states and not from the local ones. Federated entities in Nigeria are directly dependent on transfer payments, and political leaders had some few information about oil sector, and that's why one can speak of transfers being incorrect due to misinformation and the inability to verify data, which is also a factor in the deformation of federalism. In conclusion, I can say that conflicts of interest and corruption could be overcome by reforming the system of interaction of representatives of different tribes and spheres with central government, and taking into account some ethnical and cultural features.
Well, and another object of our research was Pakistan. And Pakistan was declared a federation in 1956 with the adoption of its first constitution. Pakistan can also be considered as a highly heterogeneous state. It's highly heterogeneous in terms of its language structure, but not in terms of its religion. The dominant religion in Pakistan is Islam, which has also declared in constitution, but the situation, the linguistic map of Pakistan is much more difficult. Pakistan consists of different ethnic groups, which can be generally divided by their language, by the language they speak, into two large groups, which are Indian languages, well, which are close to Hindu, for instance. They inhabit the east and the south of the territory of Pakistan, and Iranic language groups, which inhabit the west and the north predominantly. So a contradictory arises between the religion and the language in Pakistan. And this contradictory also affected the genesis of federalism, which we'll show later. Pakistanese model of federalization was kind of different from the Nigerian one, because first of all, it was more like a long and winding road. It consisted of two phases. As it was said before, Pakistan was declared a federation in 1956, which occurred 9 years after the formation of the independent state of Pakistan, which secessed out of British India in 1947. However, the constitutional entrenchment of federalism in 1956 didn't mean that Pakistan adopted a governmental system which is peculiar for federalism. For instance, Pakistan did not adopt a bicameral parliament in 1956. And the final emergence of federalism occurred in Pakistan only in 1973, as it was enshrined in Pakistani third constitution. There is a number of reasons and peculiarities for this long way to federalism in Pakistan. The first one was the point that Pakistan actually changed roles in federalism. It withdrew from a federation in 1946. Before this date, in 1947, sorry, before this date, British India had been already declared a federation according to the Government of India Act of 1935. So it was effectively withdrawing from the already existing federation, and it had to deal with federalization on its own territory. This meant that the Muslims, which were the main initiators of secession and which were the minority in British India, their representative was the All Indian Muslim League, established in 1907. In the Pakistan as independent state, the Muslims were not a minority at all, they were a majority. And they had to deal with it. And they had to deal with the linguistic and ethnic diversity of the young state. This actually leads us to the contradiction we already named, the contradictory between linguistic heterogeneity and religious homogeneity, which was very sharp these days. And another interesting peculiarity of Pakistani model of federalization is that the Declaration of Federalism had been issued before the introduction of real federalism. The introduction, only the partial introduction of federal institutions affected large minorities, such as the Bengalis, whose mother tongue was Bengali, and the denial of their rights led to the war between Bengalia, which is now well known as Bangladesh, and Pakistan itself, which ended with the creation of the Bangladesh state in 1971. This war led to large movements in the concept of federalism in Pakistan. And as a consequence, the Constitution of Pakistan, adopted in 1973, ensured the establishment of full-fledged federalist institutions, the most important of which was the bicameral parliament. Analyzing all aforesaid, we can say that the interactions between key political actors in post-colonial Pakistan had more influence than colonial institutions, as all the general contradictories between religion and languages were masked during the colonial rule, and when they released after the independence of Pakistan in 1947, new government and new political elites, which were predominantly Muslims, had to deal with it.
Let us talk about energy complex of Pakistan and its influence on the development of Pakistan as a federal state. So Pakistan's main energy resources are natural gas, oil, hydropower, and renewable resources. Pakistan imports nearly a third of these energy resources, as I said, an import-driven energy policy is not sustainable for Pakistan, making it energy insecure in the long term. Besides being a drain on its foreign exchange reserves, it exposes the economy to international energy price shocks, putting the entire economy at risk through inflation. Weak governance, uncoordinated energy policy making, and the lack of long-term energy planning only add to Pakistan's current energy woes. What is the reason for these large imports? It is due to a shortage of energy reserves and limited production capacity. It leaves parts of the country without basic necessities of life, such as gas, electricity, etc. Pakistan has to import the missing volume, imposing a debt burden, which eventually finds its way into higher taxation. The solution to supplying the population with the necessary resources is to set up such a system as supply chain. This system could transport resources to consumers at short notice, and furthermore, such a communication system is the basis for federal interaction in the redistribution of resources.
So we shall actually now come to a conclusion and outline the main lines of comparison between Nigeria and Pakistan, which we have found out and actually which we followed during our report. These main lines were colonialism, federalism in its ethnic aspect, economic situation, so the distribution of economic goods, of resources between different federal actors. And the last but not least point is the purpose, federalization. So speaking about colonialism, we've found out that the colonial background played a different role in formation of federalism in Nigeria and Pakistan. In Nigeria, colonialism created the basis for gradual step-by-step federalization, whereas in Pakistan, this didn't happen. And the interaction between the local elites, the interaction on the point of both ethnicity and religion played a key role. Turning to the ethnic aspect of federalism, we can say that both Nigeria and Pakistan are highly heterogeneous states from the ethnic point of view. And adopting a federation entailed a compromise in these societies, highly fragmented societies, to achieve homogeneity while maintaining multiculturalism, so some kind of compromise. But in Nigeria, the multiculturalism can be considered as complete, so both from a religious point of view and ethnic point of view, and the Pakistani compromise was more peculiar, standing on the points of religious homogeneity. It still offered an opportunity to ethnic heterogeneity. Speaking about the economic situation, both states have to deal with the problem of distribution of resources between different actors of federation, but Nigeria, being a resource-rich rentier state, has to deal with the institutional reforms and governmental practices which can positively affect the distribution of these resources. Whereas Pakistani, which is poor in natural resources, should deal with with the transport, with the communication between actors to achieve a justifiable supply to these resources. And the last but not least point is the purpose of federalization. Speaking briefly, we can say that Pakistan tried to unify the political system, whereas Nigeria chose a way of a bigger, wider decentralization. So chose to maintain pluralism. So this is our report. We would be very happy to listen to your questions and to answer them. Thank you very much.
Perfect. I suppose that, dear Professor Eric, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, please. First of all, I have to say Anna and Ilya's paper is such a high quality contribution, and I think both of them should be commended on what a great piece of work they have done. And I'm surprised to hear they're undergraduate students because the level is very high. So it was a pleasure listening to the paper. I'm going to ask questions that are not technically in the paper, but I'd love to hear what they both think if one takes a few counterfactual sort of points of view into account. First of all, I think it's very important to bring Pakistan into the picture because it's often not one of the usual cases that are included in comparative analysis. So the emphasis on the unitarian tendencies in Pakistan. For a moment, if we did a counterfactual thought exercise and remove the conflict with India from the picture, remove the civil war with what became Bangladesh from the picture, and take Pakistan exactly it is and move it and put it next to New Zealand, would it have ended up being as unitary as it is now? In other words, is there an element of the geography, the neighbors, the conflict that has led to a more state building and centrist sort of inclination in Pakistan? Not necessarily economic factors, not necessarily colonial heritage, not necessarily ethnic composition, but the neighborhood Pakistan is in. So that would be my first counterfactual thought exercise in terms of whatever, there is no right or wrong answer, but I'd love to hear what Anna and Ilya think about that. And the second one is similarly to bring a counterfactual thought exercise into the Nigerian example. And had there been no oil in Nigeria, and therefore no rentier economy and no opportunity to divide oil wealth between the elites of different ethnic units, would Nigeria have remained the same pluralistic but unified federal system? Or is there something in the way that the oil that is found in the south keeps the north in the game? In other words, in comparative terms, when we try to understand the success or failure of federalism, is perhaps oil something that keeps Nigeria together? So I'd love to hear what they both think on these two questions.
Just a minute. Everything is good.
Thank you very much for your notes and questions, and we would try to answer them both. Well, first of all, about Pakistan, we would say that, as we noted before, federation as a form of government, as a form of political system in Pakistan was mostly a result of the inter-elitary compromise in the post-colonial period. And the colonization only gave a framework, a legal framework of this federalization, which was like Government of India Act of 1935. So this compromise was vital for Pakistan, even though if we don't take into account all the things connected with the conflict with India, if we don't take into account the problem of Bengalia and Bengalian language, we see that from our point of view, this compromise was vital and was crucial in any case, in any circumstances, because it was initiated by political elites which were abroad in British India, where the Muslims were a minority. And as they became a majority, they had to deal with the problem on their own area. And building a nation state, for instance, a nation state, like a nation state unitary state, they would actually turn to a problem with this linguistic lines, linguistic borders. So it's close to impossible to unify the country, which is so heterogeneous linguistically. But if they had chosen a complete federation, they would come against their own principle, which they declared in colonial period. And this principle is the governance and the domination of Islam as a consolidating factor. So from our point of view, this compromise, and there is, as a result, federalization of Pakistan was crucial and was the most effective choice, even though we don't take into account the conflicts with India and Bangladesh, and we don't take into account the problem of natural resources.
As for your second question, we think that oil factor and energy complex is not a key one. Let us look at the point of ethnicity. For example, Nigeria has its ethnic group divisions for such principle as at the heart of unification is the principle of overlapping groupings rather than crossing, linking them with others. And some groups, some tribes were in the territory of Nigeria, occupying this area by a specific range of the right of primacy of occupation of territory and the right of inheritance. So we have such a situation as a state in a state. And in every ethnic group, there are some political leaders, some governors, which is not can we compare with another tribes. That's why oil sector is not the stone to the main stone as a federalism aspect. We have such aspects as ethnicity, of course, and so on. We think that if if we can choose ethnicity as a factor, Nigeria will stay as a federal state. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Any other comments? Sure.
Just very briefly, just the time is late. Thank you very much for your really comparative study, because we're speaking more about methodology, but now we have a really comparative report, which is just coincides with our section title. So that's why I thank you very much. I think it's an important note that I'm supposed just to say, and just to thank you for your report. And then it was just very nice duet, double voices singing, and I like it. I like it very much because you have a very wise division of the parts which you presented before our courier. So thank you very much. But I have also a question. You devoted quite a lot of attention to the history and the historical aspects, and I agree with you, especially for Pakistan. I know that the name itself, which appeared in the 30s and which was promoted by Iqbal, composed of the first letters of different regions of actual Pakistan, except for the so-called Eastern Pakistan. Bengali was not considered by Pakistani promoters of independence as a part of Pakistan. So that's why I think it was quite natural, the later separation of these two parts and just appearance of a completely separate and independent state of Bangladesh. And of course, linguistically and ethnically, they are closer to the Indian Bengali, and historically and culturally, except for religion. But anyway, it's important just to know. But I have a question about the pre-colonial situation. Does it affect the option of federalism for both countries? Because we know that Nigeria has quite a long history, and Hausa had their own pre-colonial statehoods, or at least just union of tribes, as well as Pakistan and Bangladesh, along with India. They just composed, and they were colonized, Pakistan and northern India, as one, or maybe not one state, but one region, which composed of different states, just of different forms of government, predominantly monarchies, but also they were different. And just even going further to the history, the northern part of India and actual Pakistan was just the one state in the period of Ashoka, which is just considered to be the first unification of India. And also historically and culturally, they are quite close, except for religion, I'd say. But even religion didn't affect many customs and habits, especially if you were present if you assist just a ceremony of marriage. They're quite close, almost similar in India and in Pakistan. I mean, that's the northern part of India. So from that point of view, it's interesting also just to point out. So from that point of view, our history, although we look at it as some kind of a discretionary, as some kind of a periods of history, but in reality, it's just consequent process. It's the process which just form ourselves as people, as persons, and as peoples. So from that point of view, did you dare or did you try just to look at the pre-colonial history and how it affects later colonial period, and also just the option for federalism in both states. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for such a deep question. We will try to answer it. First of all, I can say that we made not maybe a huge, but still an impact on the pre-colonial period of both Nigerian and Pakistani history. For instance, in our article, we tended to examine the the early period of states of Hausa in Nigeria and Pakistan as a part of Great Mughal Empire before the British rule. So we dedicated some paragraphs to it too. But we would say that from our point of view, the main condition of a federalization as a process, as a political process, is a condition of modern state, not an empire or a tribe state, but a modern state. A modern state as a concept which was developed by a historical and sociological tradition of Max Weber, and it means that the modern state is a state which has its own distinct borders, its own distinct some kind of probably national or civil identity, which has its bureaucracy, which has its professional army, so a modern state. That's why we were moving in the paradigm of a modern state, and we treated this condition as the condition of modern state as the mean for the federalization. That's why, from our point of view, it's very difficult to judge about the opportunities of federalization, for instance, looking at the imperial background of Pakistan, of modern Pakistan, or the background, the diverse background of Nigeria. So that's actually our point of view. Thank you very much.
Great. Any other comments? So we may go on, right? Thank you. Dear colleagues, it's my honor to introduce to you our next speaker. Professor Alexandra Troitska. I'd like to give you the floor. Professor Troitska is Doctor of Law, professor in the Department of Constitutional and Municipal Law of the Faculty of Law of Lomonosov Moscow State University. The topic is sure to be unique, bioethics in the federal state, divide or empire. Welcome.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for this great opportunity to speak here on an issue that has been of interest to me for a long, long time. It's a great honor and pleasure for me, so I'm grateful for having me here. And on my topic, next slide, please. Можно следующий слайд, пожалуйста? I'll tell a very short story today. I'd like to present the case related to the regulation of abortion, American case, and on this basis ask a more general questions that concern legislative power in a federal state. And as for the regulation, next slide, please, of bioethics in a federal state, and next one, please. Yeah. the Dobbs case, which was decided this summer, served as a serious trigger for me, and you all obviously know this story. Near 50 years ago, the Supreme Court of the USA recognized the constitutional right to abortion, and at that time reaffirmed that the regulation of abortion cannot be all the same strict when the fetus is not viable and when the fetus is viable. And of course, everyone noticed that in the Dobbs case, the idea of a constitutional right to abortion was just cut off. It's quite dramatic, and all the comments, or nearly all the comments, were about it. And even one of my students wrote a very good paper about it, and I'm very proud of it. But I'm personally more interested in the federal story now than in abortion itself. A regulation of abortion was returned to the states to a large extent in this decision of the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court has left less room for itself in this matter, it means that there is noticeably less room for federation in this matter, at least this time. And next slide, please. To compare, in Russia, almost all essential provisions are at the federal level. About this bioethical question, I mean about the abortion, it's not a constitution, it's a law, but still there are some quite clear provisions. And this is a fairly liberal approach, I could say, by the way. But then again, I'm not interested right now whether it's liberal or not. What matters is what the federation establishes, and subjects can no longer do otherwise. And therefore, the first question that arose in my mind when I saw the American decision in the Dobbs case was its, next slide, please. Is it possible, next, okay, to do this in Russia? I mean, is it possible to leave the entities to decide for themselves about abortions? In principle, abortion is about health care. Well, and health care is a shared competence in the Russian Federation. And in principle, the federal legislator could leave it to the entities. The federation could take general principles, for example, like protection of maternity and so on, and leave details to the entities. Well, a number of weeks is a very specific provision, we can see it. But in fact, in Russia, it can be so. It seems to me that it's not possible way, because, and now we can move to the next slide, please. A different term of an abortion is a different situation for women in different entities. But our constitution forbids it because the Article 19 of the Russian constitution prohibits discrimination on the reason of place of residence. Okay. And at the same time, we will return back to the United States. Of course, in the United States, too, constitutional rights should be the same for everyone. But suppose that we say that the right to an abortion is not a constitutional right anymore, and federal constitutional right, I mean, then we can see the duties of the states, American entities. They should not revoke privileges or immunity of citizens. But let's say that abortion is not a privilege or immunity. And then nowhere is said that the states should ensure equal regulation throughout the federation. State must provide for equal regulation only in their territory. So Miss A cannot have an abortion after 6 weeks, for example, if she lives in state X, and Miss B cannot have an abortion if she lives in state X after these 6 weeks. And it's not a problem if Miss C can have an abortion after 6 weeks in the state Y, how to put it. And here I let us not consider that Russia can perhaps also do like the United States. Well, just say that there is no such right to an abortion. And then we could say that we will introduce different regulation and the rights of women won't be affected because our constitution also doesn't directly contain the right to abortion. There is no right, and then different regulation doesn't mean discrimination of rights and no violation of Article 19. I do not agree with this approach, and in my opinion, it would be wrong. It would be very sad manipulation. But now I want to ask a more abstract question. How does federation relate to the principle of equality of human rights in general? And you can see here on this slide that in principle, federation means allowing different regulation. Different regulation means in its turn the admission of different rights and freedoms for a person. And if different rights are not possible, then we can have a federation. And that's the point that was concerning for me for a long time. And I understand that federalism is very important. I know several ideas and some benefits that federation provides for. And next slide, that's my conclusions. I know all the risks that centralization of power brings with it, but still I must ask the question, but in a very low voice. Is it possible to have a federalism in Russia? Let me be understood correctly. I am not a fan of the US decision on abortion. I don't need abortions personally, but I do prefer our federal regulation. And yet, I understand that our federal regulation is not truly federal. It's federal formally, but it's centralized essentially. And more than that, it cannot be otherwise because of Article 19. And the paradox is that the Article 19 is not about federalism at all, but it does cut federalism. So our federation can rule, but cannot divide. And our federation, in the end, maybe cannot be a federation. We can have various provisions on federal matters, constructions for divisions of competence, and so on, but still no different regulation and federalism in essential meaning. So that's the point. Thank you.
Well, perfect. Dear Professor Troitska, thank you a bunch for your riveting study. Never have I imagined that such a unique issue may be studied in regard with federalism. So we may start our discussion. Who would like to put a question to a speaker? Any comments? Welcome.
As usual, I have a couple of questions. I'm sorry for being so talkative and probably, but I don't mean just to make our discussions longer, but it's an interesting topic, especially just in light of elections in the United States, because the question of abortion became one of the key topics, while we looked first of all at the probable and possible changes in the foreign policy of the United States, while the majority of voters looked first of all at the domestic policies, including abortion, which affects many, many families. And it was a lot of discussions around all this. So from that point of view, I have two questions. I'll try just to be very short. The first one, to what extent the issue of the right of abortion did influence the electoral campaign and the results of the election of 2022? If you know, if it is not your interest, of course you may say, and it's we'll just pay no attention. And the second question is the respective Supreme Court ruling an example of judges' activism in the United States? Because we know that judges' activism in many cases is quite common for the United States in different aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you for these questions. I will conjoin them because, well, the election process, it wasn't in my focus of attention. So I do prefer to study the decision of the Supreme Court. And, well, exactly from the point of view of argumentation and counter-majoritarian dilemma and activism of the constitutional review body. So for me, it's quite interesting to see this question as a political one, of course, and to see that political views of judges are very important and decisive, I could say, in the process. So for me, to have this case as a central case for election, it's okay. It's a normal part of political process. It can be political, but it must be political. But to be on some part for the Supreme Court, it's not quite obvious that it's possible. And still, we can see the change in his view, its view. So Yes, it's a great question. And for me, the answer is about the justification. So if the court can explain just, well, not correctly, but in a rather complete way, at least, why it changes its mind, it's okay. But if no, and it's the case, so we still have some questions, interesting questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you especially for the topic you raised, because it's very important. Bioethics, unfortunately, in Russia is not very popular. While it is an important question, just dealing with different aspects of governing, and especially in the federation, because in any case, any federation, including the United States and Russia, has some asymmetry as well in mentality, ideology, religion, and so on and so forth. And so that is why it is very important. We began with the discussion on subsidiarity. And it's also a part of it. It's asymmetry so the federation may and can as well provide some unity in diversity. And that is why there are possible asymmetries, including in bioethics. And that's why it's important how to maintain balance of both diversity and unity in one state. Thank you very much.
In one state with the principle of equality, I would add. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Professor Eric, welcome, please.
Thank you, Professor Trotskaya. That was a very interesting topic, a very interesting presentation, very timely, but also comparative federalism. It brings out into the open a number of issues about our theories on how the very same federal constitution and the very same format creates different interpretations based on different time periods and different political parties and different issues. So in comparative terms, I would like to hear your opinion on American attitudes to the role of the federal state and constituent states based on their political partisanship. So having looked at the American case and having examined it, in principle, have you found either the American left or the right more likely to support federal government or state governments, or is it just a matter of partisanship based on which level of government they find closer to their political interest? In other words, what I'm trying to ask is, does the American Democrat or the Republican Party, in principle, at the abstract level, appear to be more federalist or more state interested? Or do you think this is something that has evolved over time? And if the federal government does social spending, leftists become more federalist. If it becomes more heavy-handed, then it becomes the other way around. So is there anything in principle that makes Americans more federalist or more state rights-based, or does this fluctuate with the partisan politics of the time? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a $1 million question. And well, I think actually, well, just right now that the second answer is more correct, but because I cannot now to demonstrate any correlations between political wings and federal questions. And support of federal or constituent unities parts. But I think that's a very interesting question for further research, because I had a question about relationships between political positions of judges and their decisions, and the question about could the court be representative body as the legislative body. But it's an interesting point of view, so I think I have to check decisions from this point of view. Thank you. I am not quite sure that I am right answering right now.
Well, thank you for discussion. Any other comments? Any other questions? Where might we move on? Right. So let's go on. Thank you, Bonch, for your report, and we will dive into issues about we are going to dive into fiscal issues in regard with federalism, and it is my huge pleasure to introduce you our next speaker, Professor Alexey Avtonomov. Alexey Avtonomov is Doctor of Law, Professor, Vice-Rector for International Relations of Griboyedov Institute or International Law and Economics. And the topic is Elements of the Theory of Tax or Fiscal Competition of the Constituent Entities in Federal States. Please, welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for giving me the floor. The time is late, and I'll try to be very brief in my speech. And even in the situation when one of our organizers, Mr. Korenkov, decided just to abstain and to restrain himself and refrain from the speech giving possibility to other people, just to represent their view. Quite understandable and comprehensive principles of taxation in the modern state, which is just actually the market liberal state. It was developed during more than 2 centuries, and as well there is just some theories on fiscal federalism. I also do not go into detail in this field because although it is also very well developed and there are different views, and it was just developed during the 10th century, at least, maybe even earlier, because it's also one of the urgent and still actual issues of any federal state. But I try just to focus myself only on some elements of fiscal competition or tax competition between the states, between the constituent entities. I also didn't pay attention. I won't pay attention to the problem of so-called vertical competition there. So, which means the competition between the federal state itself and the constituent entities, because in my view, it's still not very well developed. Although there are some studies and some people argue that there is such a competition, but in my opinion, it's not very well fundamented in many cases because of some studies which shows that not always federal taxation policies affect strongly or considerably the policy, taxation policy at the constituent entity level. Sometimes it may just promote the raise of certain federal taxes may cause some raises of constituent entities taxes and so on, but there is no obvious correlation in many cases. Sometimes they do not affect completely such policies. But I think it's a very important issue, especially in the field of approbation and experiments. While sometimes constituent entities are more flexible in innovations and just are open to changes and reforms. And sometimes they may try something new, which later became common for other constituent entities and the federation itself in general. For our country, it's a little bit more difficult for such a competition. But previously, in the 90s, some innovations, including in the field of taxation, just were tried at the level of certain republics and other constituent entities, such as Tatarstan, for example. They tried just quite a lot, which later was considered as a good experience and may be used at the federal level as well. Moscow experience was not so bright, especially the federal government usually opposed to Moscow innovations, especially in the 90s. But anyway, it was also quite a very interesting experience. But it's only two examples. Some other constituent units also required effective and efficient in certain innovations, including the taxations before the adoption of the taxation code, which just eliminate any kind of experiments at the level of the constituent units. But I think so. That's why I think it's important. But I cannot consider it as some kind of a real competition between the federal center and their constituent entities. But what about the competition, tax competition between or among constituent entities? It really exists even today, even in Russia, although, as I said, I have said, our constituent entities are quite restricted in the possibilities of taxation flexibility. As you know, they have only just a part of income which we may just collect from taxes established by the federal government through taxation through the taxation code. And so all amendments to the taxation code usually affect all the taxation system, which is not a common case for many federations, because usually the constituent entities have the right to establish, reduce or increase their own taxes, although they may coincide with the federal taxes. The only exception is for the real property taxation, which is traditionally is a part of the local government. But it's clear, because it's impossible just to take some piece of land or in a building from a specific locality and just transfer it to another place. So that's why it's quite obvious the ties and links between the real property and the local community and their prosperity. What about all other taxations, including income, taxation, value added taxes, and many others. They are or taxation on sales or turnover taxes and many others. They can be transferred, and they can be collected both by federal government and constituent entities. And from that point of view, constituent entities being quite, more or less free in their taxation policies may compete between them. And usually there are three groups of aims or targets at which their taxation policies are aimed. First of all, is just to make this or that constituent entity more attractive for capitals, just attraction of capitals. That means that taxation policy may create better conditions for the development of business in this or that place. And as you know, for example, the state of Delaware is one of the most unknown, but one of the most attractive states, because it's although there is a great struggle against just so-called specific offshore jurisdictions, but the state of Delaware is one of them. And that is why probably, just returning to the question of judges, that is why probably the chancellery courts, which disappeared almost everywhere in the common law systems, including the United Kingdom, where they appeared, but not in the state of Delaware, because it's much more comfortable for decisions of business cases, and that is why it's still quite prosperous there, and it's just there is no any sign of disappearance of it. So the second group of targets at which aimed competition, this type of competition, is a provision of social services and benefits. So for the population, if the constituent entity government would like just to attract more population to their states, they try to use these tax policies as one of the benefits, just providing better social services. For example, as you know, one of the best examples is California. Although the taxes are quite high there, but the social policies also, at least also is at a very high level. And for many people, it was a good decision. Maybe not now, it's just all this struggle around LGBT and so on and so forth. California became one of the promoters of these new policies in this field, but previously these policies of high social services was very attractive for the population. So that's why it was one of the most populated states in the United States, and many people would like just to move there, although sometimes it was difficult for different reasons, including high prices for real property and so on and so forth. So, and the third targets at which aimed such competition is just politics. So different political forces and different parties try to use the issue of taxes as one of the ways just to gain more popularity among people, and as well sometimes the heads of that constituent entity try just to be also considered as a good governor to run elections at the federal level. This is the case not only of the United States, but of many federal states, especially with a long history. So the governor in the United States or the head of the provincial government in Canada or the head of certain government in other federal states may claim for being a federal leader, including on the basis of her or his popularity in their own constituent entity. It's also, but in many cases, it's just based only also on the taxation policies. So I would like just to make a quite short remark as well, dealing with the population. Usually, it is considered that all the people are in favor of low taxes, and it's just some kind of a rule, but it's not quite true. It's not correct. As I said, for example, the example of California or example of Canada in general, because Canadian taxes are much higher than in the United States. But I know quite a lot of Americans who just moved to Canada for different reasons, but they are not afraid of high taxes as well. And one of the examples that population sometimes also understand that not all things which are considered to be profitable from the first side is considered to be is good. For example, around 10 years ago, there was a referendum in Geneva as a canton as well of Switzerland. And an issue was just put to the referendum. If people are in favor of free of charge public transport, and the majority said no. Yes, and they explained why. They explained that even if public transportation is still subsidized by the cantonal government, but in any case, it gains some money, and this money might be used for the improvement of the means of transport. And if it were completely free of charge, it would be a good pretext for the cantonal government not to improve it at all, so that it's too heavy for the cantonal budget and so on and so forth. So from that point of view, I don't think that we also right just to afraid. Oh, you know that in Russia it is impossible just to put an issue of a financial issue on referendum. In general, it's very difficult just to put any issue on referendum. But anyway, the financial question and special budgetary question is prohibited just to put to the referendum. So one of the explanations is that the people wouldn't understand the results of the adoption of their decision. But examples of other countries show us that it's not true in any case. And sometimes, yes, it was an experience in California as well, that once in the late 70s, there was just an issue put to the referendum. If people would like just to have lower taxes, they voted yes. But finally, many social programs were cut down. And so finally, when the question was why, the answer was because you have lower taxes now. And then so next year, they organized a new referendum and people just voted in favor of increasing taxes, but preserving the previous social programs and probably just to introduce some new. So from that point of view, people understand, people are not so silly not to understand the results of their decisions and the links between taxes and the social services. So from that point of view, said that one of the targets of this competition is making life more attractive in the specific constituent entities, including provision of social services, so-called benefit taxes. When people understand why this or that tax is collected, and for what reason. Of course, there are some other reasons, but at least if the taxes are high and social services are at a high level, of course, everybody, maybe not everybody, that the majority understands this connection and this they may create links. So just to resume and just to wrap up, I would like to say that thank you very much for just listening to my short ideas or short abstract of my report, and I think that it's very important just to continue to develop the theory of fiscal or tax competition between or among constituent entities, just to promote it at all countries, and it might be very good for the further. We use this word just a point of growth, but this, in my opinion, tax competition might be also some kind of a sources for the growth of economy for different constituent entities to decide themselves how to attract capitals, people, and resolve political and economic problems. So thank you very much.
Dear Professor Avtonomov, thank you much for your in-depth analysis. To be honest, I have been hooked by your topic, and so let's launch the discussion. Dear Professor Eric, would you like to ask a question? Yep, sure.
Yes, please. This is a very interesting topic, and I think as a paper, it ties in very nicely with the previous one by Professor Trotskaya in terms of if there are no differences across constituent units in policies, then there is no federalism, was one of the points she had made. I also think it's very important for one thing that Professor Avtonomov has highlighted some of the widely held assumptions and questioned it. And I think generally, probably influenced by American federalism, this belief that federalism is a race to the bottom in social policies, in taxation policies and social spending. It's not always correct when it comes to the people's choices. There are many Europeans within the European Union who are willingly moving to Sweden despite its very high tax rates. So there are many, many other issues when it comes to taxation and policy differentiation, and particularly competition. So here is a question I had for Professor Avtonomov. He mentioned in the speech, in his talk, that not in every federation do constituent units have the liberty of experimenting with different taxation policies. So if we reverse the logic of federalism from the bottom up to perhaps a top-down one, I wonder if there are instances where the central government picks one or two of the constituent units as a policy experimentation, but not necessarily from the bottom up as something that people or their provincial governments or the cantonal government or through referenda decide to adopt different policies. But from the top down, certain constituent units are picked for policy experimentation, different, be it taxation policy, be it public policy, be it a different attitude towards bioethics or whatever public policy that comes to mind, to see how it works, what the people's reaction are, the long-term consequences. So is there a benefit of policy lab attitude, even when the degree of constituent autonomy might not be at the same level of, say, Switzerland?
So thank you very much for your question. In reality, the answer is on this question is to an extent is in your report when just the form and the content as well, because sometimes what we need, and so the just to making comparative federalism true comparative, what we need just to study, especially in this pilot projects and certain constituent entities, is just not only if they're effective or not, but in what situation, because sometimes certain constituent entities do not have the same possibilities, and probably they need some different approach to the same issues. It was interesting, but now we are, for example, we discussed it once also in the late 90s in Russia, and once I was some people argued that it's impossible just to make to make the development of all the constituent entities of Russian Federation just developed at the same pace. They explained that, for example, the Yaroslavskaya Oblast had and has also oil refinery, but the neighboring Kostromskaya Oblast doesn't and didn't have. And I said that, for example, yes, but we need to study the approach of the regional government to the resolution of problems and just to find the local resources for the development. And I explained that, for example, in Kostroma, it's much easier just to develop tourism for different reasons. I don't mean just to go into detail now. And what was interesting, in the late 90s, many people just laughed at it and saying, how can you compare tourism and oil refinery? But now many countries live on the incomes coming from tourism. And actually, we're also in Russia saying that we need to develop so-called tourist clusters at North Caucasus or in Far East, just to develop these regions. Now it's just common, but in the late 90s, it was considered to be some kind of absurd just to propose this as some kind of an alternative source of resources. And from that point of view, I think that any pilot project, which might be just developed in certain this or that region of the state, might be used only on the basis of analysis and probably later synthesis on exploration of what are the conditions for the development of this situation, for this taxation policy, and what are the results in a very specific situation, and to what extent it's applicable to another region. And if there is any other possibilities for another region to develop comparatively similar policy or not. So from that point of view, I think it's an important way of starting, and it's a very strong side of federalism in general. And that's why I think it's also, we need just to discuss all this. We have, we shall have tomorrow a special section on fiscal federalism. But in the majority of cases, fiscal federalism reduces to the discussion of interbudgetary relations, while I think that it's more important just to discuss these policies, taxation policies, and the action of different constituent entities, rather than only interbudgetary. I understand that it's very important, interbudgetary relations, so federal budget, state budgets, and so on and so forth. But I think that as well, it's very, very good just to promote this activism, which is not judges, but political activism at the regional level as well. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor.
Well, perfect. Thank you very much. Any other comments? Yep, sure, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for a really interesting message. But let me speak from layman's point of view. Well, we were discussing the problem of budget equalization in the context of mechanisms of centralization. So, well, it can be much more profitable for one constituent entity to charge low taxes. So we also discussed that federation is an alliance based on economic profit. So if it's not profitable for a constituent entity to be a part of federation, if federal center forces it to lower the taxes or make it like, you know, I forgot the word bigger, but okay, that's it. Maybe it's a threat to federation, the whole concept of having an opportunity to make constituent entities to change their fiscal or like tax policy. Thank you very much.
Normally, in the majority of federations, of course, it's just the constituent entity itself just choosing their policies, and so from that point of view, it's okay. That's why I say that this activism, we need this activism. Unfortunately, in Russia, in many cases we think that such activism may break the federation itself, which is not completely true, because the federation as well should be attractive to any state. The people living in constituent entity should understand what are the benefits for them just to live in a federation. But in many cases, we use only just interbudgetary relations, saying that if you can just look especially at the local government, when in 2003, the law on federal government was drafted, I heard myself, but not in the just as an expert, I heard myself that some representatives of the presidential administration said that answered to the question posed to them, how local governmental authorities may fulfill all these obligations and duties imposed by the federal law. The answer was, it's good, because in this situation, they would come to us asking for some extra money, and we can control them. But I think it's not good for the it's not good for the local government as well, because it will just create some kind of a attitude to the federal government, to the state, to the constituent entity government, and to everybody as some kind of a source of income, instead of considering itself as a part of the big body. And being very passive in searching for new sources of resources, it leads to the deterioration of the economic and social situation. Although the federal government would like just to provide more and more money, but if the local authorities are efficient in their spending or not, it's difficult just to control everything and everybody. It's better just to promote active position at the local level. Just returning to the beginning, to the principle of subsidiarity, when we're saying that we can use our this or that possibilities, that we can acquire this or that powers, that means that we can really fulfill our duties before the population, before the voters or the population in general, because we know what we can do and for what money we can do this or that. And this will be just a responsible position, in any case, at the local level, at the level of a constituent entity, and at the federal level itself. So from that point of view, I think that it's why I think it's important, especially in the comparative context, rather than just discussing all this interbudgetary. It's important. I don't mean just to say that's less important, but it's completely different. And although they're probably not complete equalization, because of course fiscal competition may lead us to some disequalities, but such disequalities exist even now, despite the fact that the majority of our constituent entities live on subsidies provided by the federal government. But still, there is no complete equality, especially in the social and social economic life. So from that point of view, promoting activism at the local level, just from the local authorities and people who would like just to govern, will be good for everybody, including the federation, just to annihilate a headache where to take money and how much we can provide for this or that region. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Thank you, dear Professor Avtonomov, for your report. I have a little question. In your report, you covered taxation by referendum. However, the decision taken in referendum is binding on everyone, even those who didn't vote for it. Gordon Tullock said in that case that voting with one's feet is an essential feature of federalism. However, if part of the state or region tries to go somewhere by voting with their feet, in the same way, we call that separatism. However, if individuals do it, it's normal federalism. At the same time, even changing taxation policy or fiscal policy will not save the depression regions. Because if people leave, its infrastructure is far inferior to regions that have already caught the wave of economic growth. Tell me, please, what can we do to counteract these negative trends? And can voting with one's feet be considered a secession?
Thank you for your question. It's just I said that I had an abstract rather than a report today. But your question, I touched upon just voting at referenda on a financial issue, only just one example. But I know all the drawbacks of all referenda in general. I can just describe it much more examples. But when we live in a society, we understand that, of course, the only way there are different ways of adoption of a decision. There might be a consensus as well. But consensus is impossible just to use in a vast majority of cases. If just a forum is small, of course, we can use it. But in many cases, as one person said, that democracy is an awful form of government, but nothing better has been invented. So from that point of view, of course, but if a monarch adopts a decision on a taxation without any voting, is it good or not? If a parliament adopts a decision which also may be just split and may just adopt a decision by a small majority. So from that point of view, anything is not perfect. Nobody is perfect, as just said in one of the movies. So from that point of view, we can say that it's better than nothing. So we live in a society, and it's, of course, if people would like just to live in this society, they try just to leave it, to emigrate, or just to do something else. But the majority of people still stay, and say, okay, we'll lose that time, but we'll continue. We'll put the new question at a new referendum, and probably we shall win. And so this is a normal way of just competition, political competition, which also one of the targets, as I said, for the competition, for the fiscal and tax competition. Then separatism is something different. It's separatism when just leading to a secession. Sometimes it is considered to be good. For example, Malaysian Federation lost Singapore, and that, yes, but you know that Malaysian Federation tried to push them out, just to squeeze them out of the federation for some other reasons. But Singapore now lives not very badly, just due to also different reasons. So any region can use possibilities they have. The region should understand what possibilities for them just to live. And in many cases, they consider to be inside, also for different reasons, inside a big country. For example, I know that one of them, when Malta just decided to join the European Union, and there was also a referendum there, and a slogan of the government was that small nations in a so big world is very weak and their voice might be not heard by everybody. But being in a big community, their voice, which is just joined by voices of other regions and countries, might be heard, and they may change the situation being inside a big entity. So for them, for Malta, for example, just to join, to lose to an extent their independence, just to join a big community means just promoting their possibility to influence, to have greater impact of their opinion on the decisions of this big community, and thus on the big policy, which is just impossible in any other case. So in many cases, it's just everything depends upon a point of view, because for some people it's better just to leave a community, for some people better to join. And so it's impossible to give one recipe for everybody. What is needed? Just join efforts and going just each to other, the federation in this constituent entity. If they're going understanding what is better for them and understanding and listening to each other, they may avoid, on the one hand, separatism, on the other hand, of complete unification with depressions in certain regions. So even in depressive regions, there are some sources, as I said, and now in certain so-called depressive regions in many countries, they used this so-called ecological tourism, for example, or historical industrial tourism as well, when they used old closed factories to organize excursions. They are saying that many years ago it was a promoters of our development. Now it is just out of dated garbage. But we can see how this actual garbage was used and how it was our brilliant in the crown of our economy. So it's also interesting, and it's many cases it's good. But each case is specific. So from that point of view, there is no any universal recipe for everybody. So thank you very much.
It's a very optimistic point of view. Depressed region is a pay for federalism, as well as rule of majority is pay for democracy.
I would like just a little bit just to precise my idea. What I think it's good for the federation to promote not just subsidies for the depressive regions, But first of all, to provide some kind of a more boring or promote, in business, it's called a business plan. When a person has an idea, he or she explains how this idea might be realized, and then people who are just decide to subsidize him or her, thinking if it is realistic or not, and so on and so forth. Of course, it is very rough comparison because at the level of society is completely different, because sometimes it's possible just to one of the ways of sanation of the enterprise is just firing out people working there. It's impossible to do in a region. But if it is just a good idea for the development, the federation may lend money to the region if they think that they may gain more money, and then they may return without even just interest to the federal government and develop their regional economy and social system at a new level. It's one of the ways how to do it, or probably there might be some other ways. Sometimes we also use, to an extent, for example, one of our billionaires was sent to Chukotka just to give his own money to promote development. I don't think it was the best example. That is why finally the people changed, because business thinking person is not a person who thinking as a state thinking person. But anyway, we try to use almost the same without using federal budgetary money. But I think there are much more other possibilities just to find a good ways just to promote the economic and social situation in this or that region. But I think everything is very specific. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, perfect. Thank you. Any other comments? Any other questions?
Excuse me, may I ask a question? I'm here.
I'm sure.
Sorry, it's very interesting. And if I understand you correctly, we need to find a balance between autonomy and independence of regions and their needs to stay in federation and fiscal aspect. And my question is about Russian Federation, because as I know, there is some problem that taxes base is weak and is not enough to peak taxes for managing successfully with their obligation with governing. And the measure which the federal may propose is to give some extra money, but they need to get a report and to control how the region spend this money. And my question is it still federation when there is such a strong dependence from federation, from this distribution of money, which are controlled so hard from federation? And we were discussing when colleagues made a report about Nigeria and Pakistan, that economical issue might be appreciated as the reason to build federation. And yes, it's not a key point, but I think that we should look at the problem. Where is the economical base, economical independence? And what could you tell me about the Russian Federation and situation here about fiscal topic? Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I said, that the Russian Federation taxation policy, just in general, is not quite common for other federations. We had some kind of experience, maybe not very successful in the 90s, when the regions introduced their own taxes. But anyway, after all this, the adoption of the taxation code brought us to a situation that there is no any any possibility for a region for just for conducting their own taxation policy, because there is a small part, the so-called part, which is going to the constituent entities budget, which might be to an extent reduced. They may just levy less money, may give some privileges to this or that organization, but it's a very narrow margin of maneuver. So from that point of view, it's not good. In my opinion, it's better just to have more active regions, and just to have more active federation. Of course, it is just in certain cases, it's impossible to avoid some subsidies and just interbudgetary transfers. It's understandable. What is, in my opinion, the best policy is just to achieve such a situation that each level of government is self-sufficient. So just to transfer money from the federal budget, just to maintain certain level of or certain standard of life in a region, it's a good pretext, but it brings to power those authorities who are quite passive and who wouldn't like just to change the situation, just to find the ways to improve the situation in the social and economic field. So from my point of view, it's not effective just to transfer money, not understand, just controlling if they are spent as it is prescribed or not. It's good, of course, it's anti-corruption policies, but it's not enough to make the constituent entities economic system working effectively enough. So from that point of view, I would like to say that as a citizen of Russian Federation who wouldn't like just to leave it, I'm not satisfied and I prefer some other policies. But I can do what I can. So as an expert, I always said the same things at different fora, and I have quite a lot of possibilities, but still the policy is the same. So what can I say? I cannot adopt a decision. I can say only what I think, and I'm doing it. Thank you very much.
Well, perfect. Thank you very much for the discussion. Well, any other comments? Well, thank you very much for the discussion. Dear colleagues, many thanks for participation in today's session. I wish we proceed sharing our ideas, our knowledge, and did not call it today. Well, I highly appreciate your attendance at the conference. You see, this session has demonstrated what cases deserve special attention and where the situation is on the knife edge. We would rather proceed getting rid of idealistic ideas, being unbiased. This is sure to be the main goal on our next session. Well, I know for sure that there is a plethora of issues in comparative federalism to study, and it is our conference that will always open for your in-depth analysis and your brilliant and even mind-boggling ideas. I would be very happy if you attend our conference next time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to everyone. It was so nice to invite me on board, and I hope next time it will be in person. I look forward to meeting you all in person the next time around, and with greetings from Morocco, from Africa. Bye-bye.
Dear colleagues, today's session was the largest concentration of experts on comparative federalism in Russia in recent years. I expressed my enormous gratitude to our colleagues. It was a great honor for us, your academics, to meet respected professors, dear Professor Erk, dear Professor Avtonomov, dear Professor Troitskaya. As I remind, our conference continues for another week, and that's all for today. Thank you very much.